What we're taught as children is that we're a name. So I was taught I was Lisa, and I had severe dyslexia, although that wasn't diagnosed until I was older. But I had severe dyslexia, and I struggled to identify as this name, Lisa. And I struggled to speak. And it felt like I struggled to be human. So I remember I kept being told to write my name, or there was a pressure to say this is my name. And I only vaguely remember it. And I remember having this feeling that I had to say that was my name, otherwise I wouldn't be human. I wouldn't be allowed in the human world to take on this name. So prior to me taking on this name, just like you, prior to your parents keep repeating you are a name, what are you? So prior to that, I didn't have a name, and I didn't really know the concept of myself and other. There was some sort of natural instinct that was coming up in the body that could recognize the difference between me and a wall. It didn't just keep walking into a wall. But there was something that was there prior to my name, prior to being in relationship with the world or with another human. And that which was there, the essence of me, didn't have a label of any kind. It just was. And the qualities of it were looking, consciousness, and this I am, presence. So the sense of presence and this empty, conscious looking. And I didn't know I had that because I didn't have the ability to think I was Lisa and I had something. I just was it. This is prior to me taking on my name. This alive, radical presence. And at that age, my memory wasn't working so well, so I couldn't really formulate who I was. I couldn't really formulate the memory. So often, prior to taking on our name, we can't remember much, so it feels quite blank. So everything was appearing, and there was a consciousness of it. So there was a recognition of everything. And there was this sense of presence, this I am presence. But it wasn't happening to someone. There was no one to hold on to it. And that presence is still here. That empty looking and that sense of alive presence is right here. I am, and there's this consciousness. It's always been throughout my life. Always. when I had my heart broken, when I was shouted at school for not completing my work, when I was bullied in the playground, when I enjoyed the most beautiful sunset, when I went on holiday with my family. When I went to university and I flew in an aeroplane and I got my first dog, and I lived in Australia, Thailand, India, France. I lived in all these different countries. There was still this I am presence and this consciousness. And no matter how much I cried or suffered or hated or laughed or loved or had joy, that consciousness and that I am presence was always there. After about the age of 5, when I started saying my name, I am Lisa, I'd stand up in class, although I most really wouldn't because I was insanely shy, so I'd be like, and then I would say my name. I began to forget about this conscious presence, this essence, which was so free and joyful, and I began to become Lisa. And Lisa began to pick up ideas from her society, from her education, from her friends, from parents, siblings, and she began to form a thought, personality-based structure. I want to rest my legs. I've got nothing to rest my legs on. Ooh. I'll put them up. And in my particular conditioning, I had a natural, luckily, inclination towards being joyful and happy. So I had a natural inclination towards a joyfulness, an innocence and happiness, and to letting go of things. But my conditioning was very, very strong that I wasn't enough and that I'd done something wrong, predominantly because of severe dyslexia and going to an education system 5 days a week for 8 hours where I failed at everything. Not just one subject, everything. Even subject I was good at, I failed at because I couldn't pass the test. So everything I failed at, and not just like failed was towards the bottom of the class, I was the bottom of the class. And dependent on your teachers, you got treated differently. Often you'd get shouted at, sent into the corner, sent out of the class, kept in at break times, shamed in front of the rest of the class. So I had a natural inclination towards joy, and that natural inclination got me lots of friends. So in that way I had positive conditioning, but I had very, very strong conditioning that I wasn't enough. And then also in my home life I had some difficult experiences as well, which also gave me the sensation that I wasn't enough, that my voice wasn't worthy to be heard, that love meant being invisible. And I'm sure lots of people with this conditioning, I'm just sort of saying all this, it sounds really negative. So what happened then is that I began to create an identity that was a victim identity. So I began to form a victim personality, even though I had no awareness of that. And then there was this identification with that. I believed it was me. So in the dream of Lisa, so in the creation of Lisa, because it's a mental creation that started at about 4 or 5 years old for me, in that mental creation, I began to feel like I was not good enough. So when I interacted with anything, I always assumed that I'd done something wrong. It was so strong, you know, being dyslexic in this society, it was so strong that I'd done something wrong. So I began to form an identity based on that, which would predominantly be, in this society, a victim mentality. And then as you begin to display that mentality, that's how other people will treat you. So because I kind of am displaying that, I'm kind of asking for it, not purposely, I don't want to be it, but I'm also attracting people that like playing the perpetrator, or I'm attracting people that like playing my leader or my boss, or all these different things. I have no idea about this. But I was lucky that I had a predisposition towards joy. So that was my luckiness. So what began to happen is that I began to identify with these neural pathways and stories of Lisa, which society was telling me who I was. And as the years went on, I began to accumulate more and more victim story and prove to myself again and again that I wasn't worthy of love, I wasn't worthy of being heard, all these different dynamics, which I'm sure so many people can relate to, and feeling like I'd done something wrong. And I thought that's who I was. I'd forgotten about this innocence prior to the identity. And I got more and more sucked into this vacuum of thoughts. But then by the time I got to 20, and because I maybe had it quite intense, this conditioning, this negative conditioning, there was a lot of suffering in my body. Like, so other people maybe at that age still didn't have such strong suffering conditioning, you know, when normally that level of conditioning is waiting for like the 40s when you have your like a midlife crisis. But I accumulated it quite young from all these different things that I spoke about, which in a way was a blessing, but I didn't know that at the time. So what it did was it began to make me question the nature of my experience, because how could experience lead to so much suffering? Like, not just in me, but in others, because I began to see it in others, because I felt this pain inside of me. I began to see it in the world, in the animals. I go into the supermarket and see all the dead animals, and when people argue the TV programs, it sort of kept validating my experience. And who speaks about suffering more than the Buddhists? So suffering and compassion than the Buddhists. So I began to get very interested in Buddhism. And this began to make me question this construct, or it didn't, at first, it wasn't even questioning it. It was becoming aware that I had a mental construct. I wasn't even aware of that. I didn't even really realize that my thoughts were projections onto the world. I just kind of thought that black was black and red was red, and someone was bad and somebody was good, and etc. So I began to question this whole identity. And this went on, and I got into non-duality, and I began to question it more. And then I began to hear non-duality. And even when I was in the Buddhist group, I began to feel this presence. When people talked about this I am presence or consciousness, I felt this love, this resonance, this remembering of being a child and looking at the world with wonder. And just being so open to possibility, like infinite possibility. So so I went more and more into it, and then began to have awakenings. And I'd already had awakenings even prior to getting into spirituality, but I began to have all these awakenings. And then eventually there was this shift. By this point, I'd done loads of work on my personality. I knew very well a lot of the constructs of Lisa. There were still constructs of the Lisa personality that were unconscious, but there was quite an in-depth understanding of what it was to be human, and my thinking, my emotions. And then there was this shift where I can't really describe it. It's like an energetic shift from being somebody that's name bound and limited and lives behind the eyes and inside the body and lives in time and is always thinking about yourself or what other people have done or said and all these types of things. There was a shift from being that to this presence, this empty presence, this silent, still presence that was watching itself. And this presence, I used to think, was inside my body and tied up with the personality structure, but the presence wasn't separate from anything that was experienced, and it was love, absolute love. And mystery and freedom. It's instant. And the personality structure kind of shifted from being the center of the show to being another element in the show.